Welcome to our online webinar and launch for the Gender Inclusion, Power and Politics Toolkit. My name is Barry Smith from Social Development Direct. I'm the Deputy Technical Director, and I'll just be helping to moderate the session throughout. But I'd like to start for introductions by introducing Seth Larty, who's the team leader for the Evidence and Collaboration for Inclusive Development program, in which the GIPP toolkit has been developed. He's also a senior portfolio manager for Christian Aid, who have been the leaders in the consortium managing the ECID program. So over to you, Seth.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many people joining this call. Thanks for joining the ECID team at the launch of the new Gender Inclusion, Power and Politics Toolkit. This work, which was led by Christian Aid and Social Development Direct, has been about 2 years in the making. And it integrates the concepts of power, gender, and political economy analysis into one resource. We have about an hour and a half for this launch. And to start us off and to shed more light on the journey that we've been on so far, we'll hear from Charles Gay of Christian Aid and Emma Hagemann from Social Development Direct. And this overview will be followed by a presentation on the practical applications of this toolkit using case studies from the 3 target countries, so Nigeria, Myanmar, and Zimbabwe. And this will be led by Maisy from Christian Aid Nigeria and Fadzai Trakino, representing Wilsa, one of our partners in Zimbabwe. And finally, towards the end, we will hear from our respondents, Jean Ruddick, who is the Senior Responsible Officer for this particular program at the FCDO, and Srilata from Kriya, based in India. And they will provide feedback and some headline comments on what they've heard. And this whole setup will then be followed by Q&As. So yes, I'm hoping that we will all be able to engage in this conversation on this exciting resource. So back to you, Barry.
Thanks very much, Seth. And just to inform you that we are planning to record this session. And if anyone has any objections, please put that in the chat box. Also, a reminder that if for any reason your name is not appearing correctly, you can just right-click on your name and rename in Zoom to show your correct name. And I think what we'll ask is for people to keep their cameras off unless they are speaking, but please do turn your cameras on when you're speaking. So with that, I'll just hand over to Charles and Emma.
Thanks, Barry. Thanks, Seth, for introducing. Hello, everybody. My name is Charles Gay. I'm the Governance and Human Rights Program Advisor at Christian Aid. Been involved in ECID program since inception, really. So it's wonderful to be here sharing this toolkit with you. And thanks so much for joining. My role is to really just talk you through what's in the toolkit and the guide. Emma's going to talk through a bit more of the process, and then we're going to hear more on the how things actually worked in the field. So just to introduce you to where you can find the toolkit, I've just put a little pop-up on the screen there to show you. If you go onto the ECID website, you can find the link, and I think the links will be shared again as we go through. You can download the toolkit in 2 parts and other editable documents, and we designed it to be able to be used on a tablet or a laptop, something that can be downloaded and printed off. There are templates that can be used that you can adapt. So that's what it is. But what is it? So let's look at what is the GIPP and why the GIPP. If we can just look at the next slide. Thanks, Rebecca. So as Seth already told us, it's an integration of 3 critical components of context analysis. We're really trying to bring gender equality, social inclusion analysis, or GESI analysis, it could be two things there, power analysis and political economy analysis together, and bring them together into one useful and easy to use guide. That was the plan, and hopefully we've achieved that. But why do we need the GIPP? I think we all know that there are fundamental links between gender equality, social inclusion, power analysis, and PEA, but they're typically conducted separately, and the potential complementarities are often missed. So when we got the opportunity to develop an integrated approach in the ECID program, thanks to the UKAID Connect funding, we set out to develop a more integrated analysis that addressed several of the concerns we had. So those would be, I think, a PEA understanding of politics and visible power in specific context tends to overlook the relevance of gender and social inclusion, as well as personal agency, not always, but often can. Conversely, traditional GESI analysis often has a limited focus on the formal systems and actors, and these can be critical gatekeepers in the achievement of positive change for women and marginalised groups, among others. And power analysis approach does help us to look at the role of hidden and invisible power, as well as informal structures, spaces, and institutions, but might underplay the importance of political institutions in the analysis. So the GIPP approach considers political economy with an embedded GESI analysis and an understanding of less tangible, invisible, and hidden forms of power. Okay. I think there's another point that we make on the slide there about how it contributes to a more accurate and nuanced data collection by drawing attention to different forms of marginalization, and that's been quite an important thing for us as we've gone through. So we want really to take that more nuanced understanding. We want to reject the one-dimensional view of marginalized groups as only beneficiaries of services or victims of discriminatory systems, and instead look to how to analyze how and where women and marginalized groups have existing or latent capacity to participate in, to engage with and exercise leadership in this process. So that's I guess the theory in a nutshell. We could spend a lot of time talking about the theory, and hopefully we'll get time to come back and talk about that later. But let me just move on to the next slide, where we look at what is actually in the GIPP. So there's two parts to it, as you can see in here, but I should just start off by saying that we drew it up during the co-creation phase of the ECID program, and with the staff of the 3 country offices where we work. We were working, so that's Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and Myanmar, and we developed a sort of a collaborative approach to developing the GIPP and then piloting it and rolling it out. So that's led to the creation of the toolkit. It's really been quite a collaborative process, and just to say what's in it then, the guide really has I guess the basic process through, but also introduces you to the GIPP approach. So the introduction talks about how to decide on the questions to ask, how to analyze the findings and using the findings to develop program options, and then learning and reflecting in regular reviews. And secondly, it takes us into a planning guidance. So taking us through planning for the process, deciding on what the key questions and issues are, how to generate a more holistic picture, addressing do no harm, exclusion and transformative change, how to develop a GESI strategy and clarity in what inclusion means for the context, setting up a task force, a local task force, embedding it into a program or mail cycle with skills development and operational support as required, the lines of inquiry and the ethical guidelines. So the planning section of the guide is really full of really good stuff. I think it's be very useful in different ways, but it takes you right through that planning process, which is critical for the GIPP. And then it takes us into the conducting of the analysis itself, where we outline the process from preparation to write up, really. So there are links to the tools, which are generally held in the GIPP Toolkit, which is part 2. And you'll find a lot of ideas really in that toolkit, a lot of possible tools to use, templates and workshop plans, etc., plus clear guide for how to write up the findings. And throughout, we promote an ongoing reflection of the analysis process. So we keep asking ourselves who's involved, who's meaningfully participating, who's been left behind, are our assumptions valid? So the guide and the toolkit come together in that way to help take us through. And really, the two things go together. So I would really I'd recommend that you download the two things together and work with them jointly. So if we go on to the next slide, where we look at some of the tools, particularly, so slide 4, yeah, thanks. So I just put 3 of the tools up on this slide just to show you, but there's a selection of tools and exercises that can help and can be adapted to suit the local context. So problem analysis really looks at the political economy of actors and institutions, linking with an analysis of power, so the incentives and behavior relationships that trigger activity and actions. It looks at visible and hidden forms of power, spaces and places of power, and again links this to the chain of causality, if you like. And we've got a problem tree exercise that takes us through what's happening in the real world and institutional change. Hopefully gives you a bit of a guide on that. We've also got power analysis tools. So the one showing on the screen there, if you can see it, is a body mapping tool which identifies power, personal, resource, positional, and inner power. So many people will be familiar with that one. We also have other tools and analysis that look at exclusion. So we have an exclusion analysis that looks into and makes us check back on whose voice we are hearing, who is participating, how can we check that and get better at it. We introduced the LILO, which was introduced to us through our partner Frontline AIDS in this consortium in ECID. And it's not reproduced in the guide, but there's a link to it. So not everything is here. We couldn't put everything in here. It would have been too unwieldy. But we put a selection of different things, and we would recommend that you use perhaps your own gender analysis tool that you are familiar with, perhaps, or a local language specific adapted tool that would be more suited to your context, but place it within the overall process. So that's the tools, and again we'll get a chance to come back and talk about how they were applied. And I should say that we also, conflict sensitivity tools are commonly used by myself and Christian Aid. We use PVCA and SCLR approaches, so it can really hit any context and any situation that you want to add in. Really open to feedback, so please let us know what you think should be in here, what shouldn't, and what we could do better. So just to move on to slide 5, which is just a summary of some of the key points that I just wanted to reinforce and emphasize before we go into looking at the process. So slide 5 is really just, there we go. So first point is integrated. It's an integrated analysis that we don't want add-ons. We don't want to be pulling something in at the last minute. We want this all to work together because we believe this gives us a more holistic picture of poverty, inequality, and exclusion. Second point, a local task force. So local ownership of the analysis and inclusion of all the, and participation of all the communities, individuals, and groups and other stakeholders is crucial. We really think this should be bottom up, and that's hard, but it's the important principle to establish here, I think. Thirdly, embedded, adaptive, and flexible. Well, we can say this a lot in our tools, but we really labor this point in this tool that it has to be embedded into ongoing programming and not a one-off. We talk about that quite a lot in the process. Embedding, again, is hard, but really worth it. And I think an embedded analysis requires program teams and partners to take ownership and to develop their own approach to making regular analysis part of their day-to-day work. So we have to have a regular and honest reflection on our programs and on the initial theories of change. And this encourages us to do that and gives us a way to revisit that. Fourthly, root the GIPP in an overarching GESI strategy and safeguarding policy, accountability framework, and ethical guidelines. And my colleague Emma will talk a bit more about how they developed that as we went in. And lastly, fifthly, I really believe that the GIPP should be accessible and live. We used it as an offline tool in this program, but we've been exploring how we could put it into something like Kobo or an online dashboard that people could use and make it more easy to go out and do regular program reviews and work with community groups and less paper heavy. But it can be used at the moment offline, but we are hoping to develop it this way. So that's it from me on the toolkit. I'll be around to discuss this further, but we wanted to give some time to talk through the process. So I'm going to hand over to Emma, who actually from SD Direct, who actually worked with in a hands-on capacity, taking the country programs and the partners and the communities through the process. Over to you, Emma.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Charles. I'm Emma Hagemann. I'm the principal consultant in the Governance and Inclusive Societies portfolio at Social Development Direct, and I'm also the GESI lead, Gender Equality, Social Inclusion lead for the ECID programme. So like Charles said, been involved right from the start, proposal stage through co-creation, inception, and was quite hands-on with the GIPP. Could we please go to the next slide, Rebecca? We're going to talk a little bit about the process. And I think the critical message here is to say that because the GIPP was embedded, it was kind of integrated into the whole project cycle, right from kind of co-creation through to inception and ongoing implementation and monitoring, evaluation, and learning. We did this, some things worked well and some things didn't work as well. And we're going to hear from the country officers about how that process went in more detail. But I'll just give you an overview of what the framework looked like process-wise and how it was adapted. So I guess phase one was when the initial analysis was conducted at the design stage. So in the co-creation, we had the privilege of having a long co-creation phase for UKAID Connect, kind of do some really in-depth analysis and develop these frameworks and tools before inception kicked off. And to do this, we set up what we called a GIPP task force. And this was a critical group that kind of reviewed, inputted into the design of the tool, reviewed the tools and adapted it in country for the different contexts, those 3 countries, Myanmar, Nigeria, and Zimbabwe, and then kind of did the initial analysis, and then we're a reference group throughout the GIPP process and the programme. They were kind of multi-stakeholder groups, so individuals and representatives from different marginalised groups, so persons with disability, women, youth, religious groups, ethnic minorities, previous Christian aid country partners, some GESI advisors in the consortium, including myself. And they were kind of tasked with kind of a few different things. And I think the first thing to say is that we recognise that we can provide a toolkit, an overarching framework, but the 3 contexts are extremely different. So they really needed that local ownership to adapt, to review the tools, adapt the tools, and decide what was suitable for their context, particularly because we were working with intending to work with the most marginalised groups in those countries. So it was a very extensive process of kind of looking at the tools, adapting them, and in Myanmar, even translating the tools into local dialect and local languages, but also very critically deciding on the do's and don'ts. So we did have an ethical framework. We also had an overarching gender equality and social inclusion strategy, and accountability processes put in place for constant feedback with our communities and our partners. And this was critical to ensure that we follow best practice and do no harm principles in terms of pulling the analysis together and engaging with different groups. So I won't go into too much detail, but we also quite interestingly set up an ethics committee which oversaw any research process and helped kind of decide what was right to do in each different context. And this included local academics and researchers. So we also spent a lot of time developing a glossary of terms. So we have the overarching global GESI strategy, which has terms like equality and inclusion, power. But what do those mean, and how do we translate them into those very difficult concepts locally? So the GIPP task force was tasked with developing a local glossary of terms before the programme started. They were also responsible for undertaking the initial analysis of pulling together multi-stakeholder workshops with CSOs, different representatives and individuals from marginalised groups, government, academics, and getting some initial understanding of the key problem and marginalised groups, and then developing key informant interviews and focus group discussions to interrogate and nail down some of those key issues that were driving exclusion around different services. So in different countries, they focused on different areas. I think one thing that's critical to say, part of our overarching GESI strategy had an objective around looking inwards. And this is very critical. And I think it's overlooked sometimes when we're talking about research like the GIPP, and we really need to reflect internally at our own organizational cultures, but also our biases that might impact implementation, but also very critically data collection. So we're constantly looking at who we're talking to, and we're not overlooking groups unintentionally, but also sometimes intentionally. Because if we're not looking at getting that more nuanced picture at the start, we are then at risk of excluding them throughout the inception, implementation, and ongoing programming. So that group, anyway, undertook the initial analysis, including a kind of a rapid contextual overview, looking at key documents in country and writing up a basic baseline kind of analysis to inform the program design. So that moved into phase 2, and the initial analysis meant we could all come together in the inception phase, each country, and decide on the kind of the regions, the focus regions. So you'll find in some countries, they nailed it down to 2 kind of different districts. It also helped us decide on the key problems of focus sectors. So was it health, education, was it GBV, was it it was a range of different things, and that process was very critical in identifying our focus. It also very importantly helped us develop the theory of change. So what are our key assumptions, and what do we aim to achieve? So that analysis helped us then go back to the GESI strategy, which is also an iterative process, and update and review that document as an overarching framework, but also then to develop local action plans. So what were the key entry points, particularly to achieve transformative change, which was the level of ambition for the programme, but also very critically, what were the potential risks? And I think sometimes analysis doesn't provide that nuanced information to really develop proper risk matrices that look at potential pushback, particularly and the risks for some of the marginalised groups we're engaging. So that's very, very important, and we're able to do that and update that on an ongoing basis. And who the blockers might be, I think that's very important. So that analysis enabled us to constantly reflect on the changing context, and also who the champions were and who the blockers were. And lastly, the more challenging process was, yes, we did the analysis, we've used that to develop and design the programme, but how do we then embed it and update it on an ongoing basis, so that we are reviewing our strategies and our MELD framework and updating and adapting when needed, and particularly during COVID, which all of us have been trying to do. So what we aim to do, and the countries will talk more about this, was to have these kind of quarterly updates where we would pull in the partners, pull in our community groups, and have a dialogue around some of the changes. And we might sometimes use some of the tools that we did in the initial analysis stage, so the power analysis, exclusion analysis, and update the GIPP. And as Charles said, it wasn't a Word document, it could be quite onerous, but we aim to turn that into a bit more of a live, accessible format for the programmes. And then we also aim to have annual harvesting workshops, which was a bit more of an intensive exercise that was really fed into our annual reviews, evaluation exercises, and our strategy adaptation process. And that is something that the countries can talk about more. But that's just to give you kind of initial overview of the intention. And I think we did do some of these things to various degrees. But the critical thing is to say that the process was framed and guided by the overarching gender and inclusion strategy, our accountability framework, which is about feedback mechanisms in place, particularly in the communities, accessible feedback mechanisms to ensure that different groups can use that, and also our safeguarding policy and strategy. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to hand over to the countries. I would like to hear from them about how they've actually applied this in more detail. I'm going to hand over to Maisy Okeke, who was the program officer for ECID in Nigeria. She was also the GESI focal person for the program and has the direct experience of implementing the GIPP in Nigeria. And she's going to talk on behalf of the other two countries as well. She synthesized some of that learning. So thank you very much. As Charles said, we're very open to feedback. It's not a finalized product by any means. We are constantly learning. But if you have any further questions for any of us, details will be shared after. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Maisy Okeke. I work with Christian in Nigeria, and I'm seated here in Nigeria. I work in Kaduna State, Northern Nigeria, and I'll be presenting on behalf of myself and my colleagues in Myanmar and Zimbabwe. So my first slide shows a female referee of a football match, and I've put this here because at the time we engaged with the partners who coordinated this, it was really interesting to have a female referee officiate a male football match, and she did it to the best of her abilities, and it just showed the community members how effective and how important it is to include women and girls in the activities that happen in their communities. So I'll start by talking about the how of the GIPP and the methodology that we went through. I know that Emma has just talked about the GIPP task force, but I would just want to highlight the fact that we had people from the academia on the task force also. We had people from our local partners, our national partners. We had some representatives from the government agencies, and at the community level, we had some community members who were part of this task force. Basically, their responsibility was to review the context and to be sure that we have the right information, we're having the right conversations at the different levels that this is happening. So after setting up the task force, we had some specific interviews with the task force members and some other stakeholders. And then we moved on to have conversations with people who had first-hand information of the context in the different locations where we worked. So people who had first-hand information with the context at the national level, at the state levels, at the community levels, just to be sure that we're getting the right information from a wide range of stakeholders. So these, all of these helped us to collate information, and then we had a validation meeting where we had wider stakeholders participating in reviewing the information that we have collected. Important to note is that we had to define certain terms in easy to understand language that fits the local context. However, we did not deviate from international standards. We just defined those terms in, using languages that people who work in communities could understand easily and relate with easily. For us, it was important to also have a regular review because across these different countries, the context is changing. whether it is political or it is around gender equality and social inclusion. We understand that the context is constantly changing. So we had regular reviews of these documents to be sure we're getting the right information, you know, and using that information to inform programming as we moved along on the project. We also used a strategy to adapt these documents to the community level. So we were getting information from the community members through the partners and then centralizing this information at Christian Aid level. So it was a bottom-top approach and not a top-bottom approach. Next slide, please. So how did the GIPP help to explore the context where we work in? The GIPP helped us to have deeper exploration of the key excluded groups and the intersectionality of their identities and how this leads to further exclusion. So we were able to engage with key groups, groups of persons living with HIV, LGBT groups of persons with disabilities, people living in rural communities, women and girls, to understand how their individual identities and the intersectionality of multiple identities you know, made them more prone to be excluded. It also helped us to identify their issues, to identify social norms and the structural barriers that they face, you know, when it comes to inclusion in decision-making processes. The GIPP tool embedded conflict analysis, PEA, stakeholder analysis, and gender analysis. So it was an all-in-one document, and so we didn't need to do these differently. It also helped us to understand the intersectionality of these different things that I have mentioned. For instance, we understood how PEA was closely related to conflict and how it affects and spurs conflict in our different communities, and you know how we could address this. Next, I'll say that the GIPP methodology was key for us in learning about the need to adapt conditions, you know, adapt to conditions of great ethnic and language diversity. For each of these countries, I'll say especially in Nigeria, as you move from one location to another, ethnicity changes, language spoken changes. So it really helped us to understand, you know, the need to adapt to these different conditions across these different areas that we work. So how did GIPP support collaboration? Because we had a wide range of stakeholders from the stage of having the task force to the point of implementation, the GIPP tool helped us to identify these different stakeholders and then to bring them all on board on the project. All through the project cycle, the GIPP was helping us identify new stakeholders, whether they were community groups like groups of farmers or groups of herders or market groups. You know, it was really important, you know, to identifying these stakeholders and getting them on board with the project. Next slide, please. I would say that GIPP also helped us to understand the different power shifts, the interests of the stakeholders, the incentives of the stakeholders, the bargaining processes of critical power holders, and to tailor, excuse me, our collaborative engagements to meet these different needs. When you move from the national level to the state and community level, different stakeholders have different incentives, they have different bargaining processes. So it was important. And this information was used to train our advocacy groups so they could advocate on the different issues that they had. It was also important for us to engage in adaptive learning. So we're learning from the context, changing the context, and doing. So we're learning and doing, changing our strategies, changing, you know, the key ideas that we had around programming, and all of this happened because of the GIPP. The GIPP methodology is I'll say it's quite flexible because it's really versatile and adaptable. So you could use it in different contexts. In Zimbabwe, it was used to analyze and understand the fast changing impact of the COVID pandemic when it started. And it was also used as to understand how we could get people on board with the COVID pandemic, how people could participate, whether virtually or in person, when we're able to do that. The GIPP is also well suited to understand the interplay of power, of politics, of poverty, of exclusion, especially in these three countries where we know that the political stage is quite volatile. It was used to understand these different concepts and how we could maneuver them to get the excluded groups to participate in the processes that we have. So I'll go on to the slide that talks about key learning from the process. We learned a lot of things from this process. First, context analysis is an ongoing process, and the GIPP helped us to do that. So context analysis did not happen only at the beginning of the project. It was an ongoing process, happening quarterly, happening twice in a year. So we're able to strategize around the different contexts that are changing. GIPP also gives ownership of the process to community members. I'm on the next slide, Rebecca. So it gives ownership of the process to community members, because we needed to get information from our community members through our partners and then collate that at our level as ChristianAid. The GIPP analysis report that emerged had fundamental influence on the project design. Like I talked about, adaptive programming. So we're learning how things were changing, learning what changes were happening, and changing our strategies basically to reflect this. Next slide, please. We had a few challenges using the GIPP, and one of the challenges is that it's not an easy tool to use, especially because we wanted community groups to play a very important and key role in collating the information. So it wasn't an easy tool to use, and one thing we could have done better would have been to train the community groups on how to use the GIPP tool. It only happened at the level of the task force, but we could have, done better at the community level. The context in the three countries are constantly changing, and so sometimes we lost valuable information at the time of review. But this could have been avoided if we had a live tool where as we observe a change or we get information about something that has changed, we quickly upload it onto the live tool. And then the task force was not able to do a joint review of the GIPP reports because of how often we're doing the reviews. So it would have been important to get the task force, who were at the very beginning of the process, to be part of the reviews happening periodically. So we're better able to understand the context and use that for programming. Thank you very much. That's all from me.
Thanks very much, Mercy. That's excellent. I'd like to then quickly hand over to our colleague Fajai Trakino, who's the National Director of Women in Law in Southern Africa, and who was a partner with the ECID program in Zimbabwe. Over to you, Fajai.
Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to share. I think our learnings were quite similar also to those from ChristianAid in Nigeria. Women in Law in Southern Africa is part of the consortium that is also implementing in the Zimbabwean program with 4 other partners. So part of our learnings in how we utilized the GIP was really to understand that in terms of interventions, we really were able to understand it as a political economy analysis tool that helped us to understand the context at different levels. So for us, it was really about where the domains of change in terms of interventions were supposed to be situated and located. And in a very complex and very fluid environment like the Zimbabwean program, the Zimbabwean context, you notice that it is not very easy to keep focus in terms of the change that you want to see, because the environment is very fluid and ever changing, and this can really bring in new issues that can really change the trajectory of your program. So we understood that our change needed to happen at a very micro level in terms of individual change, in terms of the subconscious awareness levels of the communities we're working with, the individual change in terms of women and men, boys and girls, people living with disabilities, amongst other marginalized groups that we had identified. We also noted that there were also changes that needed to happen at a meso and also at a national level. And our understanding in terms of the issues, whilst we're dealing with a broader health program, we also, just like the Nigerian program, also understood through the analysis the intersectionality of rights and how these rights also affected the major issue of concern, which was really health, that we're focusing on. So our analysis also showed us through the GIP that for us to be able to address health rights, we also needed to look at it not from an isolated issue, but to also address that there are other socio-economic rights that needed to be fulfilled for the same target group to enjoy other rights as well. So you notice that in our context, one of the major issues that kept coming, especially from the community dialogues and the interactions that we had at community level, was the issue around access to water. There were also issues, especially in Manicaland, around the humanitarian crisis that they have also suffered as a region. So this would be peculiar possibly from other districts where ECID was also being implemented, in that this particular region had also suffered numerous humanitarian crises, starting from climate change, cyclones, and so forth. So this also had adverse effects in terms of the actual health rights that we were actually focusing on. So for us to be able to navigate and support them in terms of access to rights, it also meant identifying the right entry points in terms of the dialogues and the right entry points in terms of advocacy. So you notice that even in terms of our interventions, we ended up also being flexible to address some of the humanitarian concerns that we felt were really pertinent to be addressed. We also noted in terms of approaches that we ended up also recognizing the role of the duty bearers and who were the different actors that the communities in the target group constantly identified as being directly responsible for the access to health. We also recognize that these actors were at various levels, some located within the formal systems and some within formal systems. So because of the complex economic environment in our country, we then recognize that health access or service delivery in itself is being channeled through two different mechanisms. There's a formal health delivery system, and then there's also people that are accessing health because they are facing various barriers and hindrances to health access. They are actually resorting to accessing health in the informal system. So we therefore were working with two complex systems, especially in the rural areas, where we noted that there was a major recognition of the informal systems in terms of service delivery, and they also had their own sort of duty bearers within that. The other complexity that we also noted as an emerging issue, especially when engaging now with the actors, was around issues to do with the obligations of the rights holders themselves. So whilst, of course, our major issue was around how do our target group access certain services, The actors or the duty bearers, on the other hand, also raise a pertinent issue around the responsibilities of the rights holders. So a lot of times, even in the rights discourse, we usually push the blame and the responsibility on duty bearers, either government officials, administrators, and so forth. And we are rightfully so by doing that. But we also recognize the other hindrance and the barrier that the various actors were also pushing back on was around the responsibilities of rights holders in terms of paying taxes, in terms of paying administrative fees for them to be able to fulfill their obligations. So we also had to bring that within our dialogues and conversations with the rights holders. And a lot of our conversations, especially around the duties of rights holders and responsibility of duty bearers, we really ended up taking them to various platforms so that there's a wider audience, like the radio programs and other social media platforms, for a broader conversations around obligations and responsibilities. It also led us to identifying new partners as we recognize our own limitations as a partner to be able to reach out and provide the necessary interventions or the necessary achievements that we required. So it also opened up to new partners, for instance, the residents associations. So especially when you're working with urban areas, we recognize that there are key actors, not just ourselves, who also had an interest in the matter. And we needed the movement of the residents association to also come on board, especially when it came to the responsibility of rights holders themselves. But overall, our learning was that in terms of interventions, the GIPP helped us to identify roles and responsibilities, to identify issues related to access and control of resources, to also identify practical needs and strategic interests. We were also able to identify issues of decision-making powers. Where is the power lying, and who needed to be influenced? And when it came to issues to do with decision-making powers, it was also identifying the right actors, the allies, the spoilers, and who we could potentially swing to our favor. We were also able to identify the various expressions of powers, because even though our target group was very clear in terms of women, men, boys and girls, and people with disabilities, we also recognize that they are not entirely a homogeneous group. Within the category of women itself, there are various groups of women. Then there's also issues around transformation, what really needed to change in terms of transformation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maisy. That was great. Your timing is perfect. I was just about to move us forward, so that's really much appreciated. We're going to move to our section where we get some critical comments and observations from our two esteemed commentators today. And I'm going to first ask Jen Ruddock to join us to say a few words. Jen is the Senior Policy and Program Manager in the Civil Society team at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And she's been, as Seth said, the Senior Responsible Officer for the ECID program. And I should say, just to remind you, that ECID was an innovative multi-sector program over the last several years, funded through FCDO's UKAID Connect mechanism that aimed to improve the access to and use of evidence to support policy influencing work at grassroots level by CSOs and excluded groups. So over to you, Jen. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks for that helpful introduction. I was going to say a few words about UKAID Connect, but I don't need to do that anymore. So as Barry has outlined, I'm the Senior Responsible Officer for UKAID Connect, which covers 8 different policy themes, including the civil society effectiveness that the ECID programme works on. I'm a last-minute replacement for Mike Batcock, who would have done a much better job at being an esteemed speaker and knows the Christian Aid programme of work inside out, having been here from the beginning. So I'm just going to talk for a couple of minutes, just reflections on what I've just heard and kind of what I've seen from the GIPP tool already, and then I'll hand over to more esteemed speakers. I guess the first thing I just wanted to say was thank you to Amy for the slickest Zoom event that I've ever been on. This is, yeah, really impressive. I guess, as Barry has said, really fundamental to UKAID Connect and what we wanted to do with the programme were these principles of innovation, learning and adaptation kind of throughout the programme, so not just at programme design stage, but kind of ongoing through implementation. And I think the GIPP tool is just such a good example of that. I think what was really interesting from Emma's presentation was just about the point about how this was developed in the co-creation phase. So UKAID Connect had a funded co-creation phase to let partners kind of develop and design their programs in a way that provided funding for that as well. And it's just really interesting to hear how the GIPP has come out of that and then been a tool that is then, I think, firstly, both useful for Christian Aid as something that you can use throughout the implementation, but also you've generated a tool that other people are going to be able to use as well. And I think that's just such a useful output of the programme. I'm really excited to be able to share the toolkit internally with colleagues. I think there's lots of different teams who would benefit from this. We've got a real move within the FCDO towards working better and working more from the countries of implementation as opposed to from HQ. And I think bringing together all these different types of analysis to make sure that we've got a proper understanding of the context. And as I said, even kind of the complexities of power within different groups, they're often treated as homogenous groups, I think will be so useful. I've seen that the slides are going to be shared, and I think that would be really helpful. I think Mercy's slide on the kind of the learning from applying this in a local context, I think would be really useful for some colleagues in our team especially. I'm not actually sure that I've got a lot more to say because everyone else has covered it so well. I guess just what I'd say is I think this is I just think it's a really exciting tool to be able to ensure that we can all kind of work better and work smarter with the local communities that we're in. And yeah, I'm just really looking forward to being able to share it with colleagues. I'm not going to be able to stay for the Q&A, which I'm really disappointed about, not because I would be able to provide brilliant answers to your questions, but because there's a lot of questions in the chat that I would like to hear the answers to. Amy, it looks like you're taking a note, so hopefully you'll be able to share that with me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a million, Jen, and we appreciate you plugging in rather at the last minute. It's really generous of you to join us today.
No, it's fine. It's been such a useful event, and I'll definitely take all of this back to colleagues when I share the tool with them as well. Thanks
a lot. Great. So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Srilata Batliwala. As some of you may know, she is the Senior Advisor for Knowledge Building and Creating Resources for Empowerment in Action. The CREA, which is an international organization that works at the intersection of gender, sexuality, and human rights. She's also a Senior Associate for Gender at Work, a global network of gender experts supporting organizations to build cultures of equality and inclusion. Srilata has been a leading thinker in the civil society sector and beyond around developing feminist leadership, theory and practice, and has also been an inspiring leader in an innovator in the area of power analysis. So Srilata, over to you for a few thoughts and reflections.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barry, and thank you for that very generous introduction. I think, as Jen said, you know, I really don't have a lot more to say on the tool. I did spend some time going through it and studying, you know, both part 1 and part 2, not in the kind of depth that I would have liked. So let me start with the sort of from the generic, joining in many other participants in congratulating all those involved in the development of this tool. I think it's really an excellent and actually a very timely and critical effort to create a tool for this kind of integrated analysis of what you rightly identified as usually very siloed pieces of analysis that are then, you know, very difficult to bring together. So I really like the way that the GIPP has approached it as an attempt to bring these different, different experiences of exclusion and the understanding of power and political economy together to look at how we can actually address social exclusion, discrimination, and so on. So there's no question that it's a really path-breaking tool and a really pioneering effort. And it's really great to hear this feedback from those who've piloted so to speak in different contexts. And I think that was very helpful for me. So in terms of the actual tool itself, a few observations I will share, and then I'll move on to what may be a slightly provocative, but hopefully thought-provoking sort of political analysis of the tool itself. Okay, so on the tool, a few things that struck me, and perhaps, these are points, I see them there, but I feel that perhaps they need to be strengthened, or that there are facets of these that also need to be addressed a little bit more. One is, of course, the whole issue of risk analysis, as I think one of our speakers pointed out. The whole element of risk analysis is very important. And I felt perhaps that could be sort of amplified a bit more in the tool, and perhaps more exercises and ways of methodologies for generating evidence and understanding of how do you map and measure and assess both current and potential risk. And I raise this because, as you know, in the last decade or so, particularly, the incidence of attacks and violence against women human rights defenders, as we call them, against women activists, or activists working with any kind of particularly silenced, excluded, and marginalized and stigmatized communities, has really, really increased. And this is all over the world because there's been a general rise in authoritarianism and regimes that are using both legal and extra-legal means to suppress dissent. I also wanted to point out that I don't know how this can be integrated, but perhaps in your part 2 of the toolkit, some emphasis on understanding the risks of doing this kind of analysis itself, of these sort of exercises themselves, of trying to map the extent of exclusion, the extent of discrimination, mapping, how power structures are operating. Even that process is high risk. So I think we need to look at what are the security, safety, defense mechanisms, for instance, in communities or inter-community support systems for those who are doing social change work on the ground, or those who are challenging power structures. So this was one. In terms of the gathering of data, I couldn't quite grasp how data on the way power operates in the intimate sphere would be. I know you have it in the body mapping exercise, but then I saw that it says 2 to 4 people in the body mapping exercise. And I didn't have time, of course, to read the instructions to the facilitators in great detail. But it struck me that in my experience, whenever you know, we try to get at the kinds of, for instance, violence that were happening in the intimate sphere, or forms of discrimination happening, you know, sort of in, for instance, intra-household food distribution, or, you know, opportunities and control of money and so on. It was actually very difficult to get at that information because there is a lot of gatekeeping in access to that type of information. So I think, you know, how you set up the process of gathering that data is actually extremely critical, and can be also quite high risk. In terms of the task force, because the setting up of the GIPP task force has a lot of emphasis in the toolkit, I was very happy to see the stress on making sure that representatives of you know, marginalized and excluded groups and their voices be very much present and represented in some form in the task force. My concern was more, and I'd love to hear more about this. I don't think I heard it in the presentations by Maisy and Fadzai, which were very compelling, but I was interested to know, how do you actually enable and equalize participation in a space with when, you know, grassroots marginalized people have to express themselves or articulate their issues in the same space as people who are actually power holders over them, you know? So I think I'm just not very sure whether the toolkit provides the second part, particularly how much emphasis has been placed on how do you actually enable equal participation. You can create the spaces, you can bring the bodies there, but that doesn't mean that the voices will be raised, because the power dynamics are operating in that space just as they are in others. So I just wanted to offer that what we have found in our practice is that it's quite important. For instance, Gender at Work has a lot of experience on this in you know, enabling oppressed people to speak truth to power, for example. And the use of embodied practices is very important. And I wondered whether this is something that the toolkit could consider adding. You know, how do you use leveling exercises at the start of a process like a task force meeting that actually empowers everybody present there to feel that they can express themselves, and without, you know, fear or a sense of intimidation. Some of that sense of fear or anxiety or intimidation is also from language. So I'm glad that the issue of language has come out so clearly from the excellent presentations by Maisy and Fadzai, because it's not just about language, meaning, you know, translation. It's also about how language is used to intimidate. So in the Indian context, for instance, the use of highly Sanskritized words in a particular language, even if it is a local language, the use of highly Sanskritized words is a way of showing, for example, your caste power or your class power, because you've had access to that kind of education, etc. And finally, I wondered whether the toolkit provides adequate tools in being able to map and assess access to services broadly. I saw yes, but access to justice and redress. So where do I go if my rights have been violated, and I know and I recognize that right and I understand that it's been violated, but how difficult or easy is it for me to actually access justice or access redress? Okay, now in the few minutes left, I'm going to come to my sort of political analysis of the toolkit. So first is that, you know, it's an excellent toolkit, but it is very complex. It requires, I think it assumes a certain, you know, a level of formal education, for example, and a certain level of skill to be able to use it. Though I do greatly appreciate the effort that's been made to simplify and make it accessible. You know, those very, very clear, concrete questions to ask in, you know, focus group discussion or in a key informant interview and so on. So my question is kind of related to a point that I believe Laura Brown made in the comment page, Laura Brown from Womankind, of can this toolkit serve as a sort of springboard for creating one that can actually be used by grassroots communities? Where, and I have very good examples from my own past experience. People like Alan Fowler who are here would know about this, where we developed a slum dwellers census. We developed the questionnaire with the slum dwellers. They administered it. They gathered the data. They helped with the analysis of the data, and they own the data. So I think I want to conclude with that question, which is the GIPP process, can it still be viewed as somewhat extractive, even if unconsciously, if those who own and control the data continue to be, you know, the NGO or the country level office of an international agency or whatever? So how do we make sure, you know, how do we address the question of the power and politics of the data itself, the evidence itself that GIPP generates? How can we make, you know, marginalized people holders of data and evidence, and you know, leverage it as a source of power for themselves and for their movement? So I'll conclude with that. Thank you. Thank you, Barry.
Thank you, Srilata. Thanks so much. And you've generated a lot of questions yourself, and there's a very lively discussion going on in the chat. So with the time left, we probably will only be able to touch on some of the highlights, but I'd just like to say before we move on to the discussion that the Gender Inclusion, Power and Politics tool, we very much regard as, if you want, a prototype, an effort to begin a process, not end it. So what, while we believe that this early stage version of the GIPP has shown real promise, all of the comments from you and everyone in this meeting are ways of contributing to the development of the approach, and it's great to have those critical challenges that you and others have raised. I mean, maybe we could start with that question, which is, you've got a number of questions you've raised, Srilata, but one of them, and if I could ask our other speakers to come on screen, I was wondering who would like to respond to that key question about the issue of complexity, and how can the GIPP approach as it stands serve as a springboard for perhaps more accessible approaches and adaptation at the community level? Can I ask one of our speakers to respond to that before I pick on you singly? Emma, can I ask you to give us a view?
Apologies, Barry, my connection froze when you were asking the question. Happy to give some views if you just repeat very quickly.
Oh, the question was really, how can we address the challenge of complexity, which both Maisy and Srilata have highlighted, that and use the current version of the methodology to adapt and develop perhaps more accessible approaches for grassroots level?
Yeah, I think this is probably a question more for the countries, but I think, as Barry said, the toolkit just gives some of the tools that can be applied, and we also recognise quite quickly that a lot of the partners had their own tools that could kind of be used in the process as well. And that was very critical, particularly when talking about accessibility and working, for example, with persons with disability and disabled persons organisations, and having that experience and that hands-on input in adapting and supporting and using the tools. I mean, I think we recognise that, you know, the toolkit itself won't, as it stands, is not kind of a format to use and apply as it is in every context. And that's why we felt it was very lucky to have that long co-creation phase, to have really deep conversations, particularly about the language and concepts. I think it's the concepts that was more the challenge of what do these really critical things mean. But at the same time, you know, we had that long co-creation phase. It was very hard to hone in and decide on what were the key focus areas for the program. So you talked a bit about justice and some of those other issues, which are extremely important. And I think the toolkit could be adapted for that, but we didn't identify that as the key focus in the countries. So I think as it stands, it's an approach that can be used. The principles can be used, but it really needs, the complexity really requires that it's led by people in country, particularly representatives from different groups. I'm going to leave there. I mean, your question around the power imbalances and how you really hear the voices from the community is an interesting one, but we might come on that a bit later. Charles, do you want to step in a bit on this one?
I agree. I think probably hearing from Maisy or others who were implementing the program who are not on today would be more useful. But I agree on that point about it takes time, because one of the things this responds to is that bad practice, I think, of people sort of parachuting in, doing a very quick context analysis, a PEA, and then parachuting back out again, or whatever the right metaphor is, to leaving people with no idea of what was going on. And so we did have a long inception phase, and we got a chance to really question what we were doing at the grassroots. And possibly people thought we were taking too long at that point. I don't know, but I feel that that's a really useful learning out of this, because complexity is part of this. Just to also say, when putting the tool together from a practical point of view, I did quite a lot of editing at the end, and it was just a bit of a nightmare to know what to keep in and what to leave out and how to present it. And we went through various iterations of how to present this in a way that people could download or use for themselves, or just doing a very basic kind of basic, simple way. And I think so it's really good to hear other people's views on this. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Charles. I wanted to just also touch on the question that Srilata has also raised, and it's been raised in the chat as well in an ethical frame. That question of managing risk and do no harm, and having an ethical approach that takes into account the significant risks that may attach to using this methodology in certain contexts, especially with particularly excluded and sometimes even criminalized groups of people. So I was just wondering, did anyone from our team, including our colleagues in Maisy and Fajai on the ground in Zimbabwe, have any observations or lessons about that ethical and risk question that has been raised?
While they're thinking, maybe I'll jump in to say that, just as an example, I know that some of the work that Kriya is doing in East Africa is with highly criminalized communities, like, you know, LBT women, for instance, and to create a space where they could come together to do this kind of power analysis and build a, a strategy together. Just the act of determining how to convene them, where to convene, how to get them there, etc., was a huge process of, I won't say just risk management, but actually danger management. Because just the act of bringing people together to talk about their experience of exclusion was so risky and had to be done so carefully. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, that's really helpful, Srilata. Mercy, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I have just a comment. Like, we know there's been a lot of banditry and kidnappings in Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was always that risk of having some of these groups maybe living in communities or around the communities that we worked in. And then a group, I will not say this group is criminalized, but they have been implicated, in some of the security issues we've had, which is the Fulani group. And so it was really dicey working with them, but we managed that because we had to go to them in their communities, and they are nomadic groups. So that was another challenge because they were constantly moving. And so it was a bit of a challenge to get them on the project, and it was a risk also for us because we had to travel long distances. In fact, one time I was so scared because I traveled on for about an hour on a very deserted road, and that area was quite a really, I'll say, dangerous place to live in. And the other risk will be minority ethnic groups who are sometimes not considered indigenous of the locations where we worked in. So maybe in a place like Anambra, where we had people speaking a very, who are from a minority ethnic group but living in a certain community. It was kind of dicey to get, the larger majority ethnic group to engage with them and to get them on board. And I'll say for Myanmar, I know they worked with groups of persons who we can term as non-state groups. So they were not nationals or are not seen as nationals of Myanmar. So it was kind of a risk, getting duty bearers to make decisions to favor these groups because they are not seen as, people who are originally from those countries. So I think those were the risks for us.
Brilliant, thank you, Mercy. I was wondering on the question that's been raised around how do we really address power imbalances and introduce some less leveling exercises, if you want, preparing the ground for this kind of engagement where at every level we still have the major challenge of convening people and groups with very different sort of power imbalances or balance of power. So without putting you on the spot too much, I was wondering, Fajai, again, as someone who's worked with this on the front lines of your work, how have you experienced that process of how have you been able to use approaches like the GIPP in a way that kind of addresses and surfaces at least those power dynamics?
Yeah, so within the Zimbabwean context, the risk more is around the civil society's shrinking space. So there is a lot of perception, especially from government stakeholders, that civil society wants to usurp the powers of government and influence communities to rebel against the current government. So that raises a lot of risk for civil society, especially where your work is really centered around social accountability. So again, it comes to the terminology to say if you're talking about social accountability, who is it that you are holding accountable and why you're talking about accountability at community level. So for us, it was really managing those perceptions. So it took a lot of time, in fact, in terms of building relationships with the key government stakeholders at various levels to understand where we were coming from and why our programming was designed in that particular manner, in that it was not really to do anything political. It was really to raise awareness amongst different stakeholders in terms of their rights and responsibilities towards universal access to health. So we also had to pick language that is acceptable within the various government stakeholders themselves, because unfortunately within the Zimbabwean community or setup, you can only access communities at government's goodwill. So you have to register a memorandum of understanding with government, and then also work with them in terms of supporting you for registry, for mobilizing the communities and the stakeholders that you require. So that was really a major challenge, because you also want them to ensure that they mobilize the right kind of individuals and not along political lines. So the relationship building took a lot of time for us, and ensuring that we had the language right. So you find that even within our documents, there's certain language within the project that we had to delete and use synonyms that are less offensive or could not be interpreted to mean something else. We also relied a lot also on the benevolence and the goodwill of Christian Aid in Zimbabwe, because they are doing humanitarian programming. So leveraging also on that to say the same partner is also supporting government in the humanitarian related programming, also help them to sort of relax in terms of understanding that, well, we are really working towards the same goal. Then in terms of communities, in terms of managing risk at different levels, we also used a different approach that we call generational approach. So it allowed us to separate women and men, boys from girls, and also along age groups, because we also realized that there are certain conversations that young people may not be able to have when older people are in the same group. Then there are also conversations that communities may not be free to speak when their duty bearers are in the same meeting, like maybe the ward councillor is there, the member of parliament is there, there are officials from government in there. So we also had to separate these groups so that there is a sense of, we called them actually safe space dialogues. And we also spoke about it with the government stakeholders to understand why we had to use that methodology. But what we were transparent about was sharing the reports with them to say, from these dialogues, this is the information that is coming out, and these are the issues that you also need to deal with in terms of perceptions around corruption, in terms of perceptions around lack of political will to address the community-related service delivery issues. So I believe that especially for the local authorities, the city council officials, they found it as a very useful platform in terms of the dialogues, because they were able to get rich information that they would not ordinarily have if they just have an ordinary council meeting. Because with the council meetings, they're usually dominated by men, they're usually dominated by political activists, and usually the discussions digress into other issues. So when you have separate groups with women on their own, young people on their own, and also disaggregated in terms of age, the richness of the information was really quite useful for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fatsai. I'm very conscious that, as usual, time, which is our friend in terms of our lives, but sometimes our enemy in terms of these processes against us. So we have a huge number of really, really important questions being raised in the chat around questions like, how adaptive can this approach be? How do you balance the GIPP process with the imperative to work within sometimes rigid program time frameworks and delivery obligations? How can we make the tool more accessible at the community level? What can you use this approach if you are not able to necessarily start right at the beginning? Is it possible to bring this in at a midpoint or in the process? The question the challenging question that you've raised, Srilata and others have raised, about how does the tool map issues of access to justice and redress, and assist those who are who desperately need guidance and support around access to justice and defense against rights violations. So what I would suggest, since we have unfortunately run out of the dialogue time in the process, that we will carefully note those questions in the chat and that have been raised that we haven't been able to address, and find a way to share some very brief answers in the follow-up to this event. I think we have all of your emails, and Amy, I'm looking to you. Do you think that will be possible if we club together and come up with some answers? Definitely, we would regard all of you as a key first rank of allies and friends in terms of taking forward the GIPP methodology. So we'll try to set up means to have an ongoing conversation. I should say that the ECID program itself, while the program is coming to an end, the partnership and the energy around GIPP has not. SD Direct and Christian Aid in particular have an ongoing strategic partnership. We both are adopting the GIPP as a core process and innovation that we want to take forward and develop and adapt. So hopefully, at least informally, we can, with you, form some kind of community of practice around this and other related approaches. So I'm going to hand over for a quick wrap up to my colleague Emma Hagemann.
Yes, thanks, Barry. I think you've made some really good kind of wrap up points yourself. I think, as we've said, we've been really in kind of learning and listening mode today, and it's been really helpful to have the comments and feedback and perspectives from our other speakers and from those in the meeting today. We think it's an innovative tool in the sense of bringing these three different areas of analysis together: the power, the PA, and GESI. But there, as you've heard, there are some kind of challenges that we've had in applying it in 3 countries, and so it is very much a work in progress. And we will go away, have further dialogue, and take on board the feedback that we've had. But we're also just very keen for you to engage with it a little bit more, take it away, see if you can adapt it, use it. We followed kind of this long, exhaustive process, but it can be pulled, I think, taken and the principles taken away and used in a lighter touch way. So engage with it. And I think, Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, but on the toolkit itself, on the ECID website, on the website, it includes 2 email addresses for Social Development Direct and Christian Aid. And please reach out to us and let us know if you've got any further comments, or if you'd like to remain in conversation with us on this tool. So what we're hoping to do is maybe in a few months' time, even when the ECID program has ended, is to kind of bring a peer group together and hear how you've applied it, and maybe also for us to kind of share a bit more about what we did at the country level. So if you're interested, please shoot us an email and we'll be sure to communicate with you when that kind of peer learning event is held. But just to confirm, all the slides will be shared, all the kind of separate processes and tools that we've talked about, such as the ethics framework, the GESI scan, and the LILO, the glossary of terms will also be circulated and shared with you. So I'll kind of leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been brilliant. Yes, I'll over to you, Barry.
Yes, well, and that is our final word. Our huge appreciation and thanks to all of our speakers today who've made time to join us from far and wide. We really appreciate it. It's been really brilliant. And we'd like to thank all of you for participating and joining us today. And I would like to finally thank Amy and Rebecca, Amy Menzies and Rebecca Martin, who have helped to set this up and organize us all for this great learning event. So with that, I'll say goodbye, and once again, go well, and thanks for joining us.